June 1998. A man loiters in the bushes outside a plush Beverly Hills mansion. But the suspicious man is not a burglar. He's Jonathan Norman, and he's in search of one of the world's most famous movie directors.
Jonathan Norman was a very dangerous man. He was pre-planned, he was purposeful, and he was about to engage in an act of predatory violence.
It soon becomes clear that Norman is not a fan. His mission is to inflict pain and possibly to kill.
Norman, what a psychotic.
He had a history of violence, and there was no rhyme or reason to some of his violent acts. Just simply he liked engaging in acts of violence.
This is the story of a crazed and deluded predator. The story of Steven Spielberg's stalking nightmare and what he was prepared to do.
They found handcuffs, a box cutter. Basically, they found an entire rape kit. And this was a very scary situation.
How one man was determined to inflict terror on one of Hollywood's most successful and revered personalities.
He had envisioned tying up Mr. Spielberg, raping him in front of his wife, and torturing him in front of his wife.
He came to believe that Steven Spielberg, David Geffen, and others were part of this gay church mafia, and that they controlled Hollywood. His delusion was that he needed to rape Steven Spielberg so that he would be adopted as his gay godson and be brought into this gay church mafia.
By 1998, Steven Spielberg was the most successful movie director in Hollywood. His string of international hits had made him one of the most sought-after people in the movie business. The involvement of Steven Spielberg in a movie effectively guaranteed its commercial success. When it came to entertainment, the director had the Midas touch.
In many ways, we're living in the world of entertainment that was built by Steven Spielberg. He is known for his big action flicks, his dramas, his war movies, and also his sci-fi movies. He pretty much created the word blockbuster.
Steven Spielberg in the 1990s was at the apex of directors. There was no better known director, more successful director. Everything he touched during the 1990s turned to gold. Everything he touches today turns to gold. He's an accomplished, well-regarded, high-profile director.
Steven Spielberg is the man in Hollywood. If somebody wants a film made and wants it to be big, they're going to go to Steven Spielberg. I mean, Indiana Jones, E.T., Jaws, they're all under Steven Spielberg's belt.
With success had come wealth, and Spielberg had built a comfortable and luxurious lifestyle for himself and his family.
Steven Spielberg is one of Hollywood's richest men. He is said to be worth over $3 billion, but based on his lifestyle and what he provides to the public, you would never know. He owns about 4 properties, Los Angeles, New York. He had a $184 million yacht, you know, not too shabby.
But the peace and tranquility of the Spielberg's life was about to be shattered by someone who had, unknown to him, desperately wanted to become a part of his world. Someone who was intent on tearing Spielberg's life apart.
Hollywood is Hollywood, and if there was a director that was likely to get focused on, it's going to be a successful guy like Steven Spielberg.
From the Midwest, Steven Spielberg had risen through the ranks of movie production, beginning with an internship at Universal Studios in their editing department.
Steven was born in Cincinnati, and he kind of bounced around. He moved from New Jersey to Arizona, and then eventually ended up in California. After high school, he wanted to pursue film, and he actually applied to USC, but was denied. Big mistake, USC. So he eventually went on to study film at UCLA, and it was there that he got an internship at Universal Studios in their editing department. So that is where everything kind of got started.
After being offered work on a number of television programs and small movies, It was the box office phenomenon of 1975 that made the young director a household name.
Jaws was the first ever summer blockbuster. It grossed over $100 million. It was the first giant movie that everybody was really excited about. It got a huge press push in TV, in media. Everybody was talking about Jaws. This was the movie that everybody had to see that summer. It was about a massive shark that was terrorizing the Amity Island, and a police officer had to come and rescue the entire island and save the summer. So this was a movie that was going to scare people, but also thrill people as well.
Within 10 years, Spielberg had followed up this extraordinary success with international hit movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and E.T.
Steven was at the top of his game when Jaws came out, and he actually rejected the offer to direct Jaws 2. Instead, he decided to direct Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It was a critical success and a box office success. After that, he teamed up with George Lucas to do Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first in the Indiana Jones series, and of course, how could we forget E.T.?
What many regard as the high point of his career came when he won the Best Director Academy Award for Schindler's List.
Steven followed up with Schindler's List, which was probably one of his most recognizable movies to date, about a German businessman who saves thousands of Polish Jewish people in the Holocaust. Now, this was very important to him because he grew up in a Jewish family, and this was a story that he was always a little bit apprehensive to tell, but he told it in a beautiful way, and it was a critical hit. It was a box office hit. It got him his first Academy Award for Best Director and Best Picture.
By the mid-1990s, Spielberg was the most sought-after and successful director on the planet. He'd taken his commercial destiny into his own hands with the establishment, along with industry veterans Jeffrey Katzenberg and David Geffen, of DreamWorks SKG, a new and highly ambitious studio venture.
In 1994, he created DreamWorks SKG with his friends Jeffrey Katzenberg and David Geffen. Now, this produced films like The Aviator, Saving Private Ryan, so it was definitely a big deal.
Nothing, it appeared, could stop Steven Spielberg.
Steven Spielberg was married twice, the first to Amy Irving. They dated on and off for a number of years, but finally tied the knot in 1985, but divorced just a few years later, and they had one son. The divorce was a little bit messy, and she ended up getting $100 million in the divorce settlement. He later went on in 1991 to marry Kate Capshaw, who he actually cast in a movie. They went on to have 5 children together and 2 adopted children.
But with stardom comes fan worship, and to protect himself, Spielberg was living in a secure home in Pacific Palisades. Spielberg had concluded that Los Angeles was the only logical place to live, as he was inextricably bound to the city by the demands of his career. Los Angeles was also the headquarters of Amblin Entertainment, the production company he ran out of the Universal Studios lot. The house on Amalfi Drive that Spielberg had chosen had a significant past, and the history of the house had instinctively attracted Spielberg.
This house was a beautiful, beautiful spread worth millions and millions of dollars, but it also had a big history. It was owned by Cary Grant. It was owned by the producer of Gone with the Wind. So he instantly fell in love with this home. He had it renovated. He had a vineyard put in that overlooks the ocean. This is what Hollywood big money will buy you. And also, when he was building this house, he wanted to make this a safe place. He had the architect make this a safe environment that nobody could get into.
In addition to renovating and redesigning the house, the architect Harry Newman and his team needed to ensure that the property was also safe and impenetrable, a place where prying eyes would not be welcome.
Spielberg had extraordinary amount of security. His house was a compound. There was no getting to Spielberg. Impossible. Normal people don't have the security that Steven Spielberg has. He has it because he knows he's a public personality, somebody who's way out there, especially at that time. He was the king of the mountain.
But one person was determined to disrupt Steven Spielberg's privacy and to make his life a living hell. His name was Jonathan Norman, and he was about to enter the director's life, and he had the potential to change it irrevocably.
Jonathan Norman had a difficult background. He grew up in Utah with his 3 brothers and his mom, and his father actually abandoned them back in 1973 because he was trying to escape bankruptcy fraud.
His father had been on the FBI's wanted list, was a fugitive from justice. He had been violent with him growing up, so there was that kind of deal going on with him.
His father was a fugitive from the law for many, many years, and during most of the time that Jonathan was growing up. So his relationship with his father was essentially going with his mother and sneaking to a phone booth somewhere where he would get a call from his father, and that's how he talked with his father over the phone, basically. That was the relationship. So it was quite odd.
After leaving home, Norman moved to Los Angeles and attended UCLA, graduating in 1990, after which he drifted through various jobs.
Norman was a drifter. He had very few, if any, friends. He didn't have his family around.
Norman had a roommate. He was living in the Hollywood area in a small apartment. I think he would work off and on as an extra on movie sets. He fandied himself as a male model. He did some bodybuilding and some training. So it was one of those things where he was earning a living as he went. It was kind of catch as catch can, whatever job he could occupy himself with at the time, and that's how he supported himself. For the most part, he was living on the good graces of his roommate, and he did have an older gentleman that was a benefactor. There was some information that led us to believe that he was probably engaging in acts of prostitution as well.
He was interested in making it in Hollywood. He was working for a talent agency at the time. And he's abusing methamphetamine. He has a likely schizophrenic condition, and he probably has a touch of antisocial personality. So he was abusing methamphetamine, and he had a psychotic mental health condition.
Norman had a history of violence, and you'd take a look at his childhood, and he was abandoned by his father at age 6. He had violent interactions with classmates in his school. He had several arrests for violence. In fact, he was on probation for having attacked a group of Jewish senior citizens with his vehicle, attempted to run through the group, and then actually got out of his car. There was absolutely no reason for him to do it. It was just a crime of opportunity, if you will. He saw a group of people, for some reason, he took it upon himself to attack that group of people.
Basically beating on them, and he's a black belt in the martial arts. Did serious harm to several people before they were able to restrain him and have him arrested.
Unknown to anyone why he did that. He claimed that they looked at him in a certain way that offended him. They claimed they were simply walking across the street having just had lunch at a local restaurant. So where do you put the blame? Obviously with Mr. Norman, he's the one that affected the attack, but he had a history of violence. There was no rhyme or reason to some of his violent acts, just simply he liked engaging in acts of violence.
Jonathan suffered, he had mental health problems, severe ones. He had severe drug problems, and I don't think you have to be a genius to put 2 and 2 together. Obviously, the way he grew up was, I'm sure, a contributing factor.
Convicted by the courts, he spent a year in prison.
He'd been convicted of assault with a deadly weapon. He was put in prison for a period of 18 months. While he was in prison, via the entertainment channels that were on television, he was able to see people like Steven Spielberg and David Geffen, some of the entertainment figures of our Hollywood community, and for an unknown reason why, he developed this fixation on Steven Spielberg.
Steven Spielberg is at the top of the list of who's who in Hollywood. So when delusion set in, it was natural that it would then gravitate towards a Hollywood-based fixation and stalking pursuit. He developed this delusional system around Steven Spielberg, fueled likely by his methamphetamine use. Jonathan Norman was a very dangerous man, and his delusion was taking him down a dangerous path as it related to Steven Spielberg.
But as Steven Spielberg would discover, Jonathan Norman was not easily deterred. And as his obsession continued, his next moves were to be life-threatening.
He believed that Steven Spielberg was his adopted father, and that Steven Spielberg had communicated with him that he had this rape fantasy. And he was asking Norman to come and tie him up and rape him. And so his fantasy was that he was going to kidnap and rape Steven Spielberg. And if need be, he would do it in front of Mr. Spielberg's wife.
Oblivious to the impending threat from Norman, Spielberg was fully engaged with the production in Ireland of Saving Private Ryan.
In 1998, Steven Spielberg took on maybe one of his most ambitious movies to date with Saving Private Ryan, about the invasion of Normandy, and he shot this in Ireland. So this was a massive production. He teamed up with Tom Hanks, he teamed up with Matt Damon to create this World War II story and bring it to life.
When the news broke that Spielberg was going to be producing and directing a movie, it was phenomenal. The excitement in Wexford and in the entire southeast, it just caught hold like wildfire. The idea that you had this god of Hollywood direction coming to make a mega movie in Ireland, in Wexford. They basically had picked out and recce'd over the past previous 12 months Ballinesker Strand on Curracloe Beach to replicate what had happened on Omaha Beach for the D-Day landings. And the fact that it was Spielberg, the biggest name in a lot of people's minds in Hollywood, was coming to Ireland, coming to a small part of Wexford, a really rural part of County Wexford, to film what we didn't know was going to be one of the biggest movies of all time. There were 1,500 extras brought in, including 750 members of the Irish Reserve Defence Forces. There were 500 guns brought in that would fire blanks, and the others that weren't real, they were all replicas. They were done in such a way that you couldn't distinguish from one to the other. Spielberg had this raw energy and intensity and a magical aura about him that people bought into. He was welcomed with open arms, and anything he wanted, he had.
Unknown to the Spielbergs, their stalker was already making his plans. On June 29th, Norman drove a rented Jeep Cherokee to the Spielberg residence.
Norman first showed up on the Spielberg estate in June of 1997. And it started out seemingly very innocuously. He drove to the front gate of Spielberg's home, said he had an appointment with Steven Spielberg. Of course, the security guard knew that Mr. Spielberg was out of the country.
He said that he was a partner of David Geffen and demanded to speak to Steven. Well, the security guard knew that Steven and his family were out of town and told him to go away.
Several days later, Norman returned to the Spielbergs' house.
But this time he was with a friend. So he opened up a day planner and showed him pictures of Steven with his head on a naked body and said that he was going to climb the wall and rape Steven.
On July the 11th, William Hunter, a security officer, had noticed a Land Rover parked in an odd position across the street from Spielberg's residence.
He showed up with a different vehicle. He initially had come to the gate driving a Jeep Cherokee, and now he was driving a Land Rover very similar to Mr. Spielberg's wife car. So they were very familiar with him, having seen him surveilling the area, driving up and down the street, being parked down the block. He was in fact surveilling the residence, looking for weaknesses in the perimeter where he might breach the property wall and make entry into the residence.
When William Hunter noticed the Land Rover, he went over to him and asked him what he was doing. He said that he was having engine trouble. Well, Hunter did not believe that and told him that it was time for him to leave the property.
A few hours later, at about 7 a.m., the Spielberg security company responded to several calls reporting a man in the backyards of the homes near to Spielberg's residence.
On July 11th, 1997, he comes back. He parks down the street, gets out of his car, jumps over a neighbor's fence and starts prowling the neighbor's backyard. Neighbor sees him, confronts him. There's an exchange of words. Norman threatens the neighbor calls police, the police arrive, and there's a foot pursuit that ensues.
One of the officers saw Norman running through bushes, jumping fences, and trying to go into other properties. When they eventually detained him, his day planner opened up, and that's when people saw the photos that he had of Stephen naked and saying that he was going to rape him. So he was detained and put into custody.
He identified himself as David Spielberg, and explaining that he had been chased by jackals, ferocious dogs owned by Spielberg.
They called a mental health response team. He was evaluated, but a tactical error. They allowed him to voluntarily commit himself on a mental health hold. And being a voluntary commitment, you're a voluntary patient, which means you can walk away.
After a short interview, Norman was released with a warning at about 10:30 a.m. For most people, a warning would have been enough, but Jonathan Norman had no intention of stopping.
5 hours later, he walked away from the mental health facility, returned to his car, immediately responded back to the Spielberg residence, where he attempted to force the gate open with his car, and he was detained by security guards.
When police arrived, they found Norman's unoccupied car parked about 2 blocks from Spielberg's residence. What officers found was disturbing.
Turns out he had a rape kit in his vehicle. He had several sets of handcuffs. He had electric shock devices for the nipples. He had envisioned tying up Mr. Spielberg, raping him in front of his wife, and torturing him in front of his wife.
In his car, he had like a day planner. He had writings that talked about his violent fantasies, which included having a pistol and forcing people at gunpoint to submit to his sexual violence. He also had pornographic pictures in which he had cut out the heads and placed pictures of Spielberg on some of these pictures.
In the notebook, he said that he was pursuing to become Stephen's gay lover. And there was also more razor blades, there was a map of the stars, there was a handbook on John Lennon's stalking. So he really thought about this.
He actually had a list in his car too of, go to the pet store, buy chloroform, get duct tape, buy handcuffs, get a replica pistol. Jonathan Norman actually had a checklist which we consider to be part of his rape preparation. He was very dangerous. He was pre-planned, he was purposeful, and he was about to engage in an act of predatory violence.
He had envisioned tying up Mr. Spielberg, raping him in front of his wife, and torturing him in front of his wife.
When asked what he was doing in the area, Norman said he had had an appointment with Spielberg about a screenplay that involved one man raping another man, and that the handcuffs and tape were props.
At the time, he's quite delusional. He claims that he was there to show Mr. Spielberg a movie project that he had developed involving a rape fantasy, and he was going to pitch his screenplay to Mr. Spielberg.
No screenplay was found in the car. Norman was placed on a 72-hour hold, which was later extended.
This time, the right thing was done. He was interviewed, mental health team responded, and they placed him on an involuntary hold, which means he could not get up and walk away and leave the hospital.
On July 14th, a security agent notified Spielberg's lawyer, Bruce Raymer, about the events on June 29th and July 11th. On July 17th, Norman was released from custody and Raymer was notified. He in turn contacted Spielberg in Ireland and told him about Norman's conduct.
And for him to have received that news during this massive operation, one of the biggest sets that he had ever created, it must have been horrendous for him. The beach itself is very remote. There are very few towns and villages nearby, so you have to go down quite a few small little boherines and roads to get to it. So if a stalker or anybody wanted to follow him, there would have been places to literally catch him out. You could just imagine the upset and the torment, him being there with some members of his family, thinking or knowing there's a stalker around, and he is going out on a daily basis, travelling quiet country roads to this massive set where there's hundreds upon hundreds of people, not knowing if the stalker is there. With 500 guns being on the set, one wonders what was going through Spielberg's mind, thinking, are one of these guys actually stalking me? Is there something going to happen here? Would a real bullet find his way to him? So there must have been a lot of torment going on in his mind. He would be brought onto set in a van or a jeep with security guards, and spending the hours on set and then brought straight back out. There was a feeling that here was this man who obviously relates very well to the general people and population, and he wasn't giving any interviews. He wasn't talking to the people. How anybody could have worked knowing there was a stalker on his case who may well have been out to murder him and deal with hundreds of people while making a mega movie is unbelievable. The torment and torture that Spielberg must have gone through. If he had not been able to compartmentalize his feelings, the entire set and the entire Saving Private Ryan could have been a disaster. It may not have happened.
Detectives now knew they were dealing with a real and present threat to Hollywood's most revered and popular director. But Norman had still to face trial before Steven Spielberg could be assured that he and his family were safe. Knowing he was the subject of such threats was terrifying.
This shook up his world. He was so frightened for himself and his family that he added extra security measures both at his home and on his movie sets, and for actually his mother as well, because he was scared for everybody in his family. He had a full security review. He had 24-hour armed guards. He had literally security all over the place because he did not want this guy to get back in. He had a motorcycle outside of his film studio. In case anybody came in, he could make a quick getaway. So this pretty much all consumed his life for quite a period of time.
Norman was in custody, and the LAPD were taking no chances.
Now that we have Norman in custody, he's in a secured mental facility, that gives my detectives some time to build a case. So we interview the neighbors, we interview the security guards. We were in fact able to talk to Mr. Spielberg later on in time and get his statement as to his level of fear. My team interviewed Norman. He was completely forthcoming with information, claimed that Mr. Spielberg had communicated with him, as had people like David Geffen and others, to communicate their rape fantasies, and that he was merely trying to fulfill Mr. Spielberg's rape fantasy. But he was completely forthcoming in that he was there to break into the house, to rape Mr. Spielberg. If need be, he was going to tie up Mr. Spielberg's wife and force her to watch the assault. He was quite detailed in how he had planned this attack. We were able to put a case together against Jonathan Norman.
I interviewed Jonathan Norman in prison, and the day I went to see him, he was in solitary confinement because he had been obsessed with and stalking another inmate. So that tells you that these stalkers will not just stick with one person, they will often have multiple victims that they're fixated upon. But when I met with him, I said, "So what shall I refer to you as? Mr. Norman, Jonathan, what would you like?" He said, "You can call me Mickey Mouse."
On January 13, 1998, Norman was brought to trial under a glare of publicity.
If you put Steven Spielberg and a stalker and a rape case in a headline, you are going to get tabloid fodder, and people were all over this story.
This was a very public proceeding. I mean, everybody knew about this. This was all over the news. People were watching, the courtroom was packed.
The state, in conjunction with the Spielbergs, laid out their charges.
What he was charged with was stalking, okay? And that's basically, making repeated attempts at trying to essentially terrorize somebody, cause fear in somebody. He obsessed about him. He fantasized about him sexually and very vividly. They got that from his own diaries.
He had a journal where he talked about his violent fantasies, about how he'd been watching Steven Spielberg, and he had this kind of hypothetical scenario where he was going to, do rape and that kind of thing. So it was a pretty twisted, delusional system that Jonathan Norman had.
In his mind, that was to fulfill Mr. Spielberg's fantasy. But truth be known, in talking to the roommate and some other acquaintances of Mr. Norman, he had long had this fixation on Steven Spielberg and would frequently masturbate to pictures of Steven Spielberg and videos of Steven Spielberg inside of his apartment. So this is something that Norman had been planning for a long, long time.
He was fixated upon Spielberg, Geffen, Katzenberg, and believed that there was this gay church mafia. And that in order to be accepted into this, because these people are like gods, that you had to do something special. And his delusion was that he needed to abduct Spielberg, cause him to develop a liking, and to do this, that was going to be triggered by a sexual assault. I mean, it was bizarre. He needed to rape Steven Spielberg so that he would be adopted as his gay godson and be brought into this gay church mafia. Steven Spielberg is not even gay. Married Kate Capshaw, children, but this was the nature of his delusional belief system, and it was a very dangerous belief.
When the trial began, Spielberg's testimony laid out his fears.
When Steven was on the stand, it was a very emotional time for him. He said that nobody had ever wanted to do him harm. He was a very well-liked person, and everybody loved him in Hollywood, so he couldn't understand why this one person would want to cause so much harm to him and his family. He said of Norman that he was on a mission and that he would not stop unless that mission was done, and that mission was to rape him. I mean, one of the most violating, awful things that can happen to a human being, and that's what was going to be done to him. So he took that stand to protect his family, to protect himself. He did not want his family to be affected by this. He had young children at the time. He had 7 children, so he wanted to make sure that everybody was protected and that Norman could not bother their lives any more than he already had.
Norman's stalking of Spielberg could certainly have ended in disaster. I think the big factor that protected Spielberg and his family was that they were in Ireland. They weren't in the United States when Norman made his attempt.
I had numerous conversations with Mr. Spielberg at the time that this case was occurring, and he would sit down and have a glass of wine with you over dinner just like anybody else would. But he valued his privacy, and he was a family man. He had children, he was married. He certainly valued that home life of his.
But Jonathan Norman's defense lawyers had a different view.
Spielberg was never, ever in any danger, nor did Spielberg ever know that he was there, had any fantasies or anything like that until his own lawyer basically told him. Once then Bruce Raymer told Spielberg manifested fear. That was enough, at least according to the prosecutor, to charge him with stalking.
But Norman had a complicated record and was about to fall foul of California's 3 strikes rule.
There was definitely bad luck involved with Jonathan Norman at every level. The 2 strikes that led to this being the 3rd strike was really one fairly minor incident where he got into a little street scuffle. He ended up kicking somebody, but it was a fight with 2 people. So they charged him with 2 felony counts of battery. He was, as I recall, he was under the influence of drugs, meth, LSD, whatever it was. Really was not in a position to help his lawyer at all, and just took the first deal that was given to him, which was basically plead guilty to these 2 felonies. Never thinking these 2 felonies that all happened in one incident were going to be the 2 strikes that another relatively minor charge of stalking, again, maximum sentence of 1 year, would add 24 years to that sentence.
Norman's incident with the group of Jewish people was coming back to haunt him.
That was a prior offense. During that first offense that he was convicted for, attacking the group of elderly Jewish people, he just had a hallucination, a command hallucination that told him to attack those people. Any claim that Norman was harmless is absolutely false.
Not saying he wasn't rightfully charged with that incident, that he didn't get punishment that he deserved for that incident. Certainly did. But for that to be the basis to add 24 years to the, to the stalking of Steven Spielberg, I thought was not legitimate. I don't think that would happen today, for example. That was back in the day, when 3 strikes was it was a serious hammer.
For Spielberg, this was a real threat, one which demonstrated the dangerous and threatening nature of stalking and the downside of fame.
When Steven addressed the court, he said that if Norman is out on the streets, I will live in fear. He was convinced that if Norman confronted him, he could have killed him, he could have maimed him, he could have raped him. He was absolutely distraught about this and knew that if Norman got out, he would go on a warpath and try to attack Steven.
I don't think that he ever truly understood the seriousness of what happened. When we go in for the sentencing, and understand he's going to be potentially sentenced to 25 years to life, the courtroom's packed. Spielberg is there and with his contingency. Jonathan Norman comes in, he's in, chains and all of that, sitting next to me. And when I spoke with him, really the comment that I got, what I got from is, wow, I didn't realize that Spielberg was as short as he was. In fact, at the sentencing was the first time he had ever been in the same presence, ever, as Steven Spielberg. So he was sort of excited by that. I mean, that's what we were dealing with. He got to meet him in one way or another. Not quite the way he had fantasized, but he was still, sort of obsessed with him.
Jonathan Norman was sentenced to 25 years in prison.
John Norman picked the wrong guy to have a fantasy about and to become obsessed with, because in my personal opinion, he never would have gotten the sentence he got had it been you or I that he, that was the object of his obsession, or somebody less important than Steven Spielberg. So Spielberg played a huge role in what ultimately became of Jonathan Norman.
He had talked about wanting to rape Steven Spielberg with force, and to do so potentially in front of his own family.
I don't know that he wasn't a dangerous person. I mean, he was a dangerous person because he has mental health issues and he's a drug addict. That makes anybody a dangerous person. But 25 years in jail for this? Come on. Crazy.
This stalking incident, I feel, has left a lasting impression on Steven. He lives a very recluse, very private life. You don't hear him talking about his family. You never see his family about. You never see him going to the big, flashy paparazzi scenes. He lives a very normal life for him. He's not living this lavish, fancy lifestyle, which one would assume would happen with a $3 billion man. He just kind of leads his life, and I think this left an everlasting fear in him.
Jonathan Norman was a very dangerous man. The lethal combination of his distorted perceptions and delusions that made him believe he had to abduct and rape Steven Spielberg and that he was entitled to do so, the fact that he was actually researching and pursuing it, made him extremely lethal.